Sometimes people comment that I talk quite a bit about John MacArthur on my channel, and there are various reasons for that. One is that John MacArthur, Pastor MacArthur, has a lot of influence in the evangelical world. He is a very prolific author, well-known speaker through his radio and television program. People know him through online media as well. His teaching is all over the place. But aside from that, he is also a very controversial figure, and there's just always a lot of interesting stories that seem to be stirred up around Pastor MacArthur. That certainly has been the case with the COVID-19 situation in his church, Grace Community Church, their conflict with the government out there in California. And one of the people that talked about that, reported on Pastor MacArthur in relationship to the coronavirus, was this reporter, Julie Roys, who has a website here, the Roys Report. And she is once again being critical of John MacArthur. This article that was just produced the other day came out, and she is really going after John MacArthur now because of his wealth and his wealthy lifestyle. The interesting thing about this reporter, Julie Roys, is really this is what she does, is she really tries to hold different ministries accountable, is the way that she would look at it. And she's trying to look for things that are unethical or inconsistent in ministries, and if there are problems, she wants to point them out. She's done that in various other places. So that is her approach here. That is what she's really trying to do here. You can read the article in full. I'll read a little bit of it here. I know a lot of people who watch my channel will have a large disagreement with what she's saying. But if you want to read this, feel free to do that. I will leave a link in the video description of this video so that you can go to this article and read it. But the title here is the Prosperous Lifestyle of America's Anti-Prosperity Gospel Preacher. So you can tell just from the title there that she's trying to point out an inconsistency with Pastor MacArthur, that he's someone who is an anti-prosperity gospel preacher. He preaches against the prosperity gospel, would be really the most accurate way to put it, but he does have a prosperous lifestyle. She says, for decades, John MacArthur has railed on prosperity preachers, likening them to greedmongers who led first-century cults. Recently, he's also taken aim at scandal-plagued evangelical leaders like the late apologist Ravi Zacharias and former Hillsong pastor Carl Lentz, saying these celebrities were in ministry only for the money. That's why liars and frauds and false teachers are in business, MacArthur said in a recent sermon. False teachers always do it for the same reason: filthy lucre, money. Yet according to financial statements and tax forms obtained by the Roys Report, John MacArthur and his family preside over a religious, media, and educational empire that has over $130 million in assets and generates more than $70 million a year in tax-free revenue. So the article is going to go on to basically look into MacArthur and his family's financial dealings and their profits and their lifestyle, talking about his homes, talking about his salary, and talking about his family involvement in Grace to You, I think it is. I think it's the Grace to You board and other entities associated with Grace to You. So it's just talking about his family involvement in those ministries and organizations and the money that they've made. So that's kind of the closing here, money and ministry. She closes, clearly MacArthur takes plenty of money from his own ministries, and though MacArthur may have never preached the prosperity gospel, a gospel that promises health and wealth, his income and portfolio looks an awful lot like those who do. MacArthur may be America's anti-prosperity gospel preacher, but his life and the life of his family members appears to be quite prosperous, and he seemingly has his ministries to thank. So this is a very critical article, and I know that a lot of people who, again, watch my channel are probably going to take real issue with her whole motive in even writing this. So I did try to explain what her prerogative is and what she's trying to do with her website. But I know a lot of people are going to take issue with her. What I wanted to do is just share some thoughts that I had in relationship to the idea of wealth. Because I think what's at root here in the criticisms is almost this attitude that it is wrong to be wealthy, or it's inconsistent to be wealthy if you're preaching against the prosperity gospel. And so just to distinguish that there, John MacArthur is saying that preaching a gospel that promises health and wealth, or that makes health and wealth the goal, is a real problem. It's not biblical, and it's not the gospel. But there are people who preach that, and they are really trying to get rich off of other people and promise other people riches. And that can definitely be idolatrous. And I was thinking about what does the Bible actually say about wealth? Because it is a big question. Is it a sin to be wealthy? As we're preaching against the prosperity gospel, which MacArthur does, is it a sin to actually be wealthy? And the Bible does say in 1 Timothy 6, those who want to get rich fall into a temptation and a trap, many foolish and harmful desires which plunge people into ruin and destruction, for the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil. I mean, definitely money can be a dangerous thing. But is it a sin to be rich? I mean, he goes on a little farther here and he says, instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be rich. No, not to be conceited, or to set their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. So I guess the first thing to think through here is it really a sin to be rich? Because it can be easy for us to just kind of make an assumption that it's wrong for someone to be rich, and that doesn't seem to be what the Bible's saying. Are riches dangerous? Absolutely. Matthew chapter 19, for example, when Jesus is talking to the rich young ruler, and afterward he says to his disciples, truly I say to you, it will be hard for a rich person to enter the kingdom of heaven. And again I say to you, it is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. I mean, clearly there is a warning that riches can lead us astray spiritually and keep us from really submitting to the gospel and responding to Jesus in the right way. So yeah, riches are dangerous, but is it a sin to be rich? The Bible doesn't really say that. And so, something that we have to think about is some people historically and even today do attain wealth and become very wealthy people. And one of the things that strikes me about someone like Pastor John MacArthur, and I think a lot of people who are wealthy, you just have to ask yourself, why do some people seem to become wealthy? And one explanation for that, among many, is that some people are very high capacity people. And I think we could definitely put someone like Pastor MacArthur in that category. It's like the CEO of a company. I mean, these are people that are not just your typical person. They are high capacity people. And so they have the ability to do things that a lot of people don't. She actually says here in the middle of this article, MacArthur logged a tremendous number of hours for Grace to You and the Master's University and Seminary, I think that is, especially considering that he also worked as pastor of Grace Community Church. In 1 year, 2012, MacArthur reportedly worked a combined 60 hours a week at Grace to You and Master's. This was in addition to the time he spent pastoring Grace Community Church, a church with an average attendance of more than 8,000 people. So obviously, just looking at that alone, you can see someone like John MacArthur is probably putting in hours that the average person wouldn't put in and really couldn't put in. I mean, most of us don't have that much energy. And again, that's why I call them high capacity people. They have an unusual amount of energy. So that's something. And then also with people that are kind of in that position, we have to realize that they do have more a lot of times. They will become wealthy, but they also have to deal with more. So I'm not trying to make a total defense of every rich person out there. I'm just trying to think through it and give some explanation here about how we assess other people. And we tend to think other people should be exactly like us. But that's not the way the real world works, and that's not how we should assess things. So, I could say, well, that person has more than I do, but do I really have to deal with the things that that person has to deal with? So we tend to sometimes look at the good, but we forget the bad when it comes to other people. That they may have good things, but they also have hard things that they have to deal with because of their position. So just, things that we need to keep in mind as we're critiquing something like this. I also was thinking about how it is easy for us to rail against wealth, and we see that a lot in our culture. There's a lot of railing against wealth, and again, as a Christian, I think there's a healthy criticism, like what I talked about with what Jesus said in Matthew 19, what we read about in 1 Timothy 6. We do need to have the right view of wealth, certainly. But I think of someone like Bernie Sanders, who criticized millionaires and billionaires, and then more recently he became a millionaire. And so he started to say billionaires when he was railing against rich people rather than millionaires and billionaires. And so I just think it's funny how in America we can have this attitude against wealth, and yet we also ourselves have a lot of wealth, and we forget that. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't be cautious, but I think we just have to realize that we're all kind of in that boat. A lot of us are wealthy by other people's standards in other parts of the world. And so as we're criticizing wealth here, we may not realize, we're actually pretty wealthy ourselves, a lot of us. So that's something we have to keep in mind, just that it is a relative thing when we're talking about wealth. That you might look at someone and say, oh, they just have so much. Why do they need that much? But the reality is a lot of us have more than we need. And if we're not careful, any one of us can fall into being selfish and not generous. But we can forget that just because we look at someone who has more. So that's just something to keep in mind too in all of this. But the real question comes back to if it's not sinful to be wealthy necessarily. Obviously what I would say is if God tells you, like Jesus did to the rich young ruler, give up your wealth, you need to be willing to do that. But it's not necessarily a sin to be wealthy, because wealth actually allows us to use it in good ways. And so this is a real question, is the use of wealth. What do we do with our wealth? That's what we're reading about here in 1 Timothy 6:17. Instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to set their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. So rich people have the capacity to help others and to do very generous things. We see that even in this country, that because of the wealth that our country has been blessed with, we've actually been able to help people in different parts of the world. And so I think as Christians, that really should be our mindset, is not so much, is it always bad to have wealth, but a real question is, what do I do with the wealth that God has given me? And what am I doing with the possessions that God has stewarded me with? And yeah, absolutely, we want to make sure that we use those with integrity, and we use those possessions and our wealth generously. So when it comes to other people and their wealth, I think we have to keep in mind, it is important to God how we use our money, but we don't always know how other people are using their money. And so one of my kind of criticisms back on the article that we're talking about here is that if you just look at the outside and you look at someone like Pastor MacArthur and his wealth, it is very easy to criticize. On the other hand, do you really know how he's using his wealth? You don't really know the whole picture. And again, I don't know the whole picture either. He can answer for himself. Obviously, it's between him and God. But I just want to be careful that I'm not going to look at his possessions and judge him when in reality he might be giving far more and be far more generous than I would ever even realize or know. And maybe he's doing things far beyond what I'm doing to help others. So it's just something I have to keep in mind. I think we all have to keep in mind when it comes to looking at other people and their wealth. So the article does talk about the fact that he's wealthy. I think another criticism is that she doesn't feel there's enough financial transparency in how they're dealing with their finances, MacArthur and his family, and you know, in relationship to how much they're making, that sort of thing. So, you know, I understand those criticisms, and I think obviously we should be open to accountability, but I'm not sure I see in this article necessarily a lot of evidence of wrongdoing. And I think it just really comes down to we don't always know the full story. And, you know, I get it. She's trying to hold someone like him accountable and to call out lack of transparency and inconsistency. But, you know, I hope some of the things that I've shared give a little bit more of a well-rounded view of what the scripture says. I'm not saying that anybody is beyond criticism. I think, you know, in reality, we're all imperfect. And so, yeah, there's a certain measure of criticism that we all maybe justifiably face at times. But I have a feeling a lot of people are going to be really angry in reading something like this. Some people will be angry against MacArthur, and other people will be angry on behalf of MacArthur because of the things that she's pointing out here. So I'd like to hear what you think in the comments below. Just please try to keep the comments as much as possible edifying and helpful to discussion. But thank you so much for listening to some of my thoughts brought to you from A Frisch Perspective.